The sun had only begun to comb gold fingers through the winter-blanched grass when Wade Kincaid saw her. She was crouched low beside the water trough, the way a starved thing might crouch, knees drawn close, hands wrapped round the rusted rim. Her face was shadowed by the angle of morning light and the ragged fall of hair that hadn't seen a comb in weeks. She bent to the water with slow, aching motion, trembling as if the act of drinking carried weight too great for her bones. Wade had just stepped out to feed the horses. He paused in the doorway, silent but watchful, his gloved hands still holding the feed sack over one shoulder. The barn door creaked as it swung behind him, and she startled, not the way a deer startles and runs, but the way something once human might, cornered too many times. She looked up. Her eyes were raw, rimmed red like she hadn't slept or stopped crying. One cheek bore an old bruise in its fading yellow bloom. Her lips parted, then closed again. There was no apology in her expression, just the stillness of someone past apology. Wade took a few steps forward, slow and measured. He didn't reach for his rifle leaning near the door. He didn't need to. She was no threat. A winded colt had more menace than this woman. "You're welcome to the water," he said. She flinched as if the kindness stung worse than scorn. "I ain't a skin for nothing," she rasped. Her voice sounded dry, brittle. "Didn't mean to trespass. Just was thirsty." Her hands gripped the edge of the trough, fingers dirt-streaked and split. Her coat, if it had once been one, was more thread than cloth. The hem barely covered the swell of her belly. Pregnant. Wade set the feed sack down without another word. He disappeared into the barn, and when he returned, he held a tin cup in one hand. It was clean, the rim dented but smooth. He dipped it in the trough and held it out. She stared at it like it might burn her. Her fingers twitched but didn't reach. "You don't gotta drink like a stray," he said, not unkind. Her throat moved in a dry swallow. Slowly, like someone remembering how to receive, she reached for the cup. Their fingers didn't touch, but the closeness held its own kind of weight. She sipped, not like someone enjoying it, but like a soldier drinking between battles. "What's your name?" he asked, once the cup came down. She hesitated. "Lenora." "Just Lenora? That's all that's left of it." He nodded, didn't press. She looked over her shoulder, toward the road that wound through the high grass and disappeared into frost-bitten hills. Her shoulders hunched under the torn wool like a dog, expecting the boot. Wade glanced at her bare feet, dirty, chapped, the left one bandaged poorly with old cloth. "You walk here?" he asked. "I ain't staying," she said quickly, voice sharpening. "Don't need your pity. Was just water. I can keep walking." He looked at her without judgment, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his worn hat. "You got a long way to walk in that shape." "I've done worse." "I don't doubt it." She wobbled a little as she stood. The water sloshed from the cup, and she winced, one hand bracing her back. Wade stepped forward instinctively, not touching her, just steadying with presence alone. He took the empty cup and turned toward the porch. "I got bread warming and coffee still hot," he said. She stared after him. "I ain't. I'm not going inside. Didn't say you had to." She stayed at the fence while he disappeared into the house. 5 minutes later, he returned with a folded quilt, a chipped plate with 2 thick slices of bread, and a tin cup steaming in the morning chill. He set them down on the top rail of the fence without a word. Then he turned and went to tend the horses. Lenora didn't touch the plate for a long while. She watched him. The way he moved, slow, sure, and without expectation. He spoke to the horses like they were neighbors. Didn't look back once. She approached the food like a woman waiting for it to be snatched away. Her hands trembled as she lifted the bread. She sniffed at first, an old reflex. Then bit. She chewed like her jaw ached, like her body was suspicious of warmth. The coffee made her eyes water. Wade didn't ask questions. He didn't hover. He just did his work while she ate. The silence was not cruel. It was the kind of quiet that grows in places where grief has long since settled. When the plate was empty, she folded the quilt tighter around her shoulders and sat on the lowest rail, one hand resting on her belly. Wade came by and collected the dishes with a nod. Cold's coming in sharper tonight, he said. You can stay in the barn, if you like. Blankets up in the loft. It stays warmer than it looks. She looked down. I won't be trouble, she whispered. He shrugged. Ain't worried about trouble. Just don't want frostbite on my conscience. She managed the smallest flicker of a smile. Barely there. Most folks would say I deserve it. I ain't most folks. She stood, wavering a little. Why are you helping me? He met her eyes. 'Cause you look like somebody no one helped when it counted. She didn't answer. Just turned and walked slow toward the barn, boots she didn't own crunching in frost she couldn't feel anymore. Inside, the loft was dusty but dry. She pulled herself up by instinct, muscles remembering ladders and ropes and escapes. She wrapped the quilt around herself and lay down, stiff and still. The scent of hay and horses soaked into her bones. She didn't cry. Not yet. Below, Wade moved about with quiet purpose. He fed the cattle, raked the stalls, and hummed a low tune with no lyrics. He glanced up at the loft once, just once, then returned to his work. As evening stretched shadows long across the prairie, the wind carried a chill that curled under doors and whispered through chinks in old boards. Wade lit a lamp and made stew for one. Then, without saying why, he poured a second bowl and placed it on the porch. He sat beside it, sipping slow from his own, watching the stars come out. It took her nearly an hour, but eventually the barn door creaked. Lenora stepped out wrapped in the quilt like a forgotten spirit. She sat on the porch edge without asking, without speaking, picked up the bowl, ate. The silence between them held weight, not distance. Afterward, she handed him the spoon and looked out toward the hills. I ain't ever had someone offer me a cup first, she murmured. Not without a skin for something back. You won't owe me, he said. She studied him, suspicious, like the world had never let her believe that. But she stayed seated. The stars above them stretched wide and quiet. And in that moment, neither of them said what hurt. But something began to ease, slow as morning thaw. A dog barked far off. A coyote answered. Lenora pulled the quilt tighter and asked, You always live this quiet? I earned it, Wade said. She gave a soft, dry chuckle. Maybe I'll earn some too. And for the first time, her voice didn't sound like it was made of splinters. Wade didn't answer, just leaned back in his chair and watched the sky. Inside the house, the fire burned low. But out here, in the hush between them, something warmer had begun to flicker. Something she didn't yet trust. Something he'd already decided to protect. The next morning brought frost so thick it turned the barn's eaves to lace, delicate and biting. Lenora was up before the rooster, shivering as she shuffled hay with bare hands, trying to prove her worth before he ever asked. Wade watched her from the porch, coffee steaming in his tin cup. She hadn't said a word when he'd brought her a proper blanket the night before. Just nodded once, chin tucked like a soldier enduring orders. She refused the house again that morning. Said the barn suited her fine. Wade didn't argue. He'd known better than to chase a skittish horse. You let them come when they were ready, or not at all. He packed her a meal without asking. A heel of cornbread, half an apple, a wedge of cheese wrapped in oilskin. Left it by the fence post where she'd first stood. She picked it up without looking toward the porch and took it to the loft like she meant to hide from sunlight. But he caught the way her fingers lingered over the food before lifting it. Like the kindness made her hand slower, like it had weight. Later that week, he found her mending one of his old saddle blankets, fingers deft and quiet. He didn't remember asking. Didn't matter. She'd seen something frayed and tried to fix it. Word got out by the end of the week, as it always did in towns too small to keep secrets and too proud to mind their own. He was at the general store, picking up nails and flour, when Cora Sutter leaned over her counter like a vulture with lip rouge. I hear you've got a guest out at Kincaid Hollow, she said, voice wrapped in sugar and poison. Wade said nothing, measured out a scoop of beans instead. A girl, someone said. Poor thing. Looks half wild, don't she? Heard she's expecting. He paid with exact change, not looking up. You ought to be careful, Wade, she called after him. Those kind ruin a good man's name. He left without answering, but the air felt heavier as he walked back to his wagon. When he returned, Lenora was sitting by the fence, trying to stitch her torn skirt with thread the color of ash. She looked up at him with eyes that already knew. Maybe she'd heard the gossip. Maybe she'd lived in it long enough to smell it coming. "I can go," she said flatly. "I don't want to be a burden, or ruin your good name." Wade tied off the horse and took a moment before speaking. "Did I say I wanted you gone?" "No. But I've seen this before. People start talking. Starts harmless. Then the preacher stops coming. Then folks stop selling to you. Then someone throws a rock through your window to make a point." He set the sack of flour on the porch and sat in the chair beside the doorway, the wood creaking beneath his weight. "I lived through worse than rocks, Lenora." She turned away, jaw tight, the wind tugging at strands of her hair. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. She laughed, but it was hollow. "What, here? With cows and silence? Ain't no place for me. Not really. You've done well with silence so far. That's survival, not a life." He didn't argue. Just let the breeze fill the space between them. The hills in the distance wore snow like lace doilies laid across their shoulders. A hawk drifted above, lazy and unbothered. She turned to him again. "I ran, you know, from a man who thought I was his property. It wasn't a marriage, just a transaction. He lost money on me, so he tried to sell me again. I took what I could and left. Ain't looked back since." Wade nodded, slow and solemn. "That why you don't let folks help?" "Because help comes with hands," she said. "And hands always take." Wade said nothing, but she noticed his didn't even twitch toward her. Just rested on his lap, weathered and calm. His silence felt less like distance, and more like space, like he was giving her room to breathe. Days stretched into another week. Lenora stayed in the barn, but the door stayed open longer now. She swept the porch once without being asked, cooked cornbread the next morning, and left a note scrawled in flour-dusted pencil. "You were out late. Figured you'd want something hot." The note said more than the food. He didn't mention it. Just left her a jar of honey by the fence the next day. No words. She understood. Sunday came with church bells carried on cold wind. Wade didn't go to town, hadn't for years. But Lenora walked the ridge trail that morning, looking down at the chapel, holding her belly like it might guide her. She didn't go in, just watched from a distance as families exited in pressed coats and gossiping huddles. By noon, the preacher came out to Wade's place. Reverend Tilson, gray-bearded and sharp-eyed, stood with Bible under one arm like a sword he wasn't afraid to use. "She's not your burden," he said after pleasantries had run out. "She's not a burden," Wade replied. "You're offering her a place folks say she doesn't deserve." Wade leaned against the porch rail. "Then maybe folks don't deserve much either. She's with child. Alone. You keep her here, you'll share in her judgment." "Judgment from who?" Wade asked. "From God? Or from Cora Sutter's mouth?" The preacher shifted, uncomfortable. "The town's got to keep its order." "Then let him keep it. I'll keep something else." The preacher didn't stay for coffee. That night, Lenora lingered by the porch while Wade sharpened tools. Her hands smelled of pine and soap. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "I heard the preacher came." "He did. What did he want?" "To save me from the wrath of women like Cora." She snorted. "That's a fool's errand." Wade smiled faintly, though he kept his eyes on the whetstone. "Told him I'd take my chances." She wrapped her arms around herself and looked at the horizon, where a sliver of sun still clung to the hills. "I ain't used to someone standing up for me." "You get used to it," Wade said. "Then you start doing it for yourself." Silence fell between them, softer than before. Familiar. "I used to have a dog," she murmured after a while. "Scrap of a thing. He'd follow me around no matter how many times I yelled. Slept by my feet, even when I had nothing. That dog thought I was worth sticking by." Wade paused, the blade still in his hand. "What happened to him?" "I stopped being somewhere he could find me." He didn't ask more. Didn't need to. Instead, he stood and took an extra quilt from the chest just inside the doorway, folded it over his arm, and held it out. "You might want this. Cold's dropping again tonight." She reached out, taking it slower than needed, like it was a test she didn't trust. Then she nodded once and stepped back toward the barn. Before she went in, she turned. Wade. He raised his head. I'm thinking, maybe I could start fixing up the old chicken coop. Might be good to keep some hens in spring. His brow lifted. You planning to be here that long? She shrugged, a hint of something shy in the curve of her mouth. Might. And with that, she disappeared into the barn's dark mouth, leaving the porch quiet and Wade oddly warmer than the fire inside. He looked out at the hills, thought about names and rumors, and how long it took for a person to grow roots after being pulled up so many times. He didn't know what spring would bring. But for now, a woman who once drank from his trough like a ghost had started speaking of tomorrow. And that, he figured, was no small thing. The wind came hard that Sunday, carrying with it a bitter sharpness that stung the skin and made every crevice whistle with cold. Snow had begun falling in slow, deliberate flakes, each one wide and wet, clinging like fingers to the barn's warped boards. By noon, the porch rail had grown a white edge, and Wade could hear the pine tree groaning behind the house under the weight of ice-laden limbs. He hadn't seen Lenora all morning. She usually stepped out just after dawn, brushing hay from her sleeves, her breath hanging like steam as she tended to whatever task she decided to own that day. But not today. Wade stepped into the barn with cautious quiet, calling softly as he entered. Lenora. No answer came from the loft. The horses stirred and stamped but gave no sign of concern. He climbed the ladder, slow but firm, boots thudding against each rung until he reached the top. She lay curled under the quilt, her face pale, eyes shut tight, lips parted slightly. Her forehead was damp. Wade knelt beside her, his rough fingers brushing against her wrist, then her cheek. She stirred, only barely, her body caught somewhere between sleep and sickness. You're burning up, he murmured. She blinked once, eyes glassy and confused. Didn't want to trouble you, she whispered. You are trouble, he said softly, scooping her up like she weighed nothing. That's the whole point. She didn't protest, didn't flinch, just sagged against him like a child carried from a nightmare. Her breath came shallow and raspy, the heat of her skin leaking through the quilt and into his coat. Inside the house, Wade laid her on the bed that had not been touched in years. He stoked the fire higher, set water to boil, and tore strips of linen with a kind of urgency he hadn't felt since the war. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and sweat before noon had fully passed. He placed cool cloths on her forehead and dribbled spoonfuls of broth into her mouth, waiting between each one like he was negotiating terms with something meaner than death. She slept fitfully, whispering half-sentences into the air, calling names he didn't recognize, maybe ghosts, maybe pieces of herself long since scattered. Outside, the snow kept falling, relentless and soft. By the second night, the fever broke. She lay still and pale, but the sharp heat was gone, leaving behind a quiet tremble and the hollowed look of someone too tired to be afraid anymore. Wade sat by the fire, coat still on, eyes flicking toward the bed every few minutes. He hadn't shaved in days. His hands ached, not from labor, but from holding back all the things he didn't know how to say. She stirred near dawn, eyes open slow, like curtains drawn back from a room not used in years. You brought me inside, she said. You were sick. I said I wouldn't be trouble. You said a lot of things. Her eyes drifted toward the rafters, the quilt pulled tight to her chin. Did I talk in my sleep? A bit. Did I say anything shameful? He shook his head. No more than any of us do when we're too tired to pretend. A silence settled between them, but it wasn't cold. It was something softer, like a hush between verses. She tried to sit, winced, and sank back down. You should have left me, she muttered. I didn't want another grave out here, he said plainly. Her face crumpled just for a breath, then steadied. Your wife. He nodded once. Mary. Lost her before the war ended. We didn't have children. She die here? No, but I buried her here, where the wildflowers come in spring. Lenora closed her eyes, let that picture root in her chest. I didn't know kindness could come quiet, she whispered. Didn't know it could come without asking. Wade didn't reply. He stood and adjusted the fire, poured fresh water into the basin, then moved toward the chest at the foot of the bed. He opened it and pulled out a second quilt, this one finer, with colors faded but stitched with care. She made this, he said. Took her 2 winters. Said every patch was something she couldn't say out loud. He unfolded it, draped it over Lenora's legs. Why give it to me? She asked, voice thick. Because you look like someone with things she can't say out loud either. She pressed her hand to the fabric, fingers shaking. The warmth wasn't just from wool. For the next few days, she stayed in the house. At first because she had no choice. Then, because he stopped pretending he didn't want her there. He cooked. She ate. Slowly, with more appetite than shame. Sometimes he read aloud from old books, weather journals, mostly, and one dog-eared volume of Whitman. She listened with her eyes closed, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. She began to mend things, his shirts, the torn edge of a curtain, a split seam in one of his coats. Her stitches were tight, patient, methodical. You don't have to fix everything, he said one afternoon. Don't know how not to, she replied. When she was strong enough, she walked out onto the porch. The snow was crusted now, hardened by sun and wind. She stood bundled in the coat he'd hung for her on the door, arms folded around her middle. They're still talking, you know, she said without turning. Let 'em, Wade replied, rocking gently in his chair. They'll say you took me in for the baby. He looked at her then, calm and steady. Did I? She shook her head, slow. They'll say you're a fool. Then they'll be telling the truth. I am a fool. Always have been. Just finally found something worth being foolish for. She turned to him then, and her eyes didn't flinch away. What if I don't know how to stay? She asked. You'll learn. Same as breathing. One day, you just do it. Inside the house, the fire popped. A hawk soared overhead, black against pale sky. Lenora moved to the edge of the porch, her boots crunching lightly over old snow. I think I'd like to build a cradle, she said after a while. Maybe out of pine. Wade didn't smile, but something in his shoulders eased. I've got wood in the shed. I'll need tools. They're yours. And that was how they said it, what most folks say with too many words. He gave her a shed and a set of tools. She gave him a cradle not yet built. Later that night, as he poured 2 cups of coffee and stoked the fire, she set the new quilt over both their knees. The old one stayed folded at the foot of the bed, a relic honored but passed on. She glanced toward him, voice low. Do you think things get better? For people like me? He met her gaze and didn't blink. I think sometimes we're not meant to be better, he said. Just meant to be different than the world expects. She nodded. I can live with that. And for the first time since she arrived, she let her head rest back, eyes drifting closed, not in exhaustion, but in something close to peace. The baby came early, under a sky torn with wind and stuttering sleet. No thunder, just that long kind of hush the prairie makes before something breaks. Wade had been hauling firewood when he heard her cry out, not like fear, not even pain, but something older than both. He dropped the bundle and ran. Inside the cabin, Lenora was on her knees by the hearth, bracing herself against the floor, one hand pressed to her belly. Her face was tight with breath held too long. It's coming, she said through gritted teeth, sweat already shining on her brow. Too soon. Wade's pulse hammered. He knelt beside her, not touching, just being there. You're early, he said, not sure if he meant the baby or her, this woman who had arrived into his life like weather no one predicted. I need the doctor, she gasped. Wade, I can't do this alone. He nodded once. I'll ride now. He stood, already moving to grab his coat and rifle. Habit, not fear, but paused at the door when he saw the shape outside. 3 figures. Standing still. One with a lantern. Wade opened the door slowly, as the sleet prickled against his skin. Cora Sutter stood at the front, cloak pulled tight, expression sharper than any wind. We heard she's birthing, she said like it was a sin. You shouldn't keep a woman like that in your house, Wade. You know it. Behind her, 2 other townsfolk stood, Mr. Gall from the feed store, and one of the ranch hands from Tucker's outfit. None carried kindness in their eyes. She needs the doctor, Wade said evenly. She's in pain. Then send her back where she came from, Cora spat. That girl's a curse. You think God's gonna bless your roof when she births under it. She's done nothing to you. She's drawn talk, gossip, She's made fools of us all. You think you can take in a woman like her, and it won't touch your name? This town has order, Wade. You remember that. She's a woman, Wade said softly. She's carrying life. You come here tonight to stop that. The wind picked up, blowing Cora's hair across her face. But she didn't blink. We come to warn you. Don't let her bring that child into our valley. Take her to the next town, where no one knows what she's done. Behind him, the door creaked open. Lenora stood barefoot on the floorboards, the quilt falling around her shoulders. One hand braced against the frame. Her eyes were wild, not with fear, but fury. In her other hand, she held Wade's old shotgun, the one that had leaned unused near the hearth for years. She raised it, not to aim, not yet, but just to hold it like a truth. She's not going anywhere, she said, her voice low and hoarse. And this child's not waiting for your permission to be born. Cora stared, blinking once, like maybe she'd never seen Lenora before this moment. Wade stepped beside her, slow and steady. He didn't touch the gun, didn't need to. He only met the eyes of those standing in the snow. You come here to shame her? He asked. You're too late. Life already tried that. And she survived it. Gall shifted his weight. The ranch hand muttered something under his breath, turned, and walked back toward his horse. Cora stood firm. She doesn't belong here. She does now, Wade said, because she stayed when the world told her to run. For a long second, no one moved. Then Cora, with trembling lips, stepped back into the snow. God will judge this, she said. Maybe, Lenora whispered, but not tonight. Wade shut the door as their figures disappeared into the white. He turned to her, reaching out gently. Let me take that. She handed him the shotgun, her arms shaking now. Her knees buckled, and he caught her before she hit the floor. The labor came fast after that. Wade stoked the fire-high, boiled water, tore sheets. She screamed once, then again, but mostly bore it in a silence that reminded him of horses standing still in stormlight. Her eyes burned with a focus so fierce it looked like war. Hours passed. The sky turned deep gray, and sleet melted against the windows in streaks. Then, just before dawn, the cry came. Sharp, new, full of breath and demand. A girl. Wade had never held anything as small as the thing he now lifted, wrapped in one of Mary's old linens, stained now with birth, but sacred in its second life. The baby's fists curled in toward her cheeks, face ruddy, mouth wailing without restraint. Lenora collapsed back, gasping, smiling through tears. She's all right, she asked. She's loud, Wade said, smiling faintly. I think that's a good sign. Lenora wept then, silently, as he placed the child into her arms. For a while, there was only the sound of fire and breathing, snow against the glass. The baby's hiccuping cries softened under the quilt's folds. Later, Wade cleaned the room, washed the linens, warmed broth. He worked quiet, precise, like ritual. He didn't speak until Lenora finally stirred. You should name her, he said. Lenora looked down at the child. Her fingers traced the baby's tiny wrist, the soft crown of damp hair. Rosemary, she whispered. For memory, for starting again. He nodded. It suits her. Days passed. The snow didn't lift for a while, but inside the house there was warmth. Wade fixed the cradle, sanded it smooth, painted it with leftover milk paint until it gleamed soft white. Lenora sat by the fire, the baby asleep on her chest, her eyes fixed not on the door, but the window, the view she had once looked to as a way out, now simply a way forward. Word came down the valley that the preacher had moved his sermons to the Mercantile. The chapel, it seemed, was no longer neutral ground. No one visited the cabin for a while. Wade didn't mind. One afternoon, weeks after the birth, Lenora stepped outside with Rosemary bundled close and stood by the trough where they had first met. The water glinted with thin ice. She looked down at it, then up at Wade, who stood beside her now, arms crossed, watching the sky. I thought I'd always be drinking with the animals, she said. You weren't, he said. You were just thirsty and out of luck. She smiled. I still don't know why you gave me the cup. Wade looked at her. Because you didn't ask, he said. And because I had one to give. The wind blew soft then, brushing across the plains like a hand smoothing rumpled sheets. In the silence, the baby stirred but didn't cry. Inside, the fire waited. So did supper. She turned toward the house, but stopped just at the door, holding the baby close. "You gave me more than a cup," she said. "You gave me a reason to." She nodded, like that settled something. And it did. That night, they sat by the fire, the baby cradled between them. Wade poured 2 cups of coffee, just like always. Lenora took hers with both hands, sipping slow. "I've never stayed anywhere this long," she said. "You're not just staying now," he replied. "You're building." She nodded. "Still don't know what to call all this." He leaned back in his chair, quiet for a beat. "I think folks like us don't name things too quick," he said. "We let 'em earn it." And so they did. In time, the porch grew flower boxes. The barn saw fresh paint. The trough stayed where it was, only now it glistened each morning with clean water. A copper dipper hung neatly on a nail above it. The cradle rocked. The wind changed. The gossip faded. And life, as it does, went on, not always easy, but never again as lonely. Somewhere between the cup and the open door, between silence and firelight, 2 strays had found shelter, not in each other, but beside each other. And that, in the end, was enough. Because sometimes the most sacred things in life aren't earned with vows or promises, but with a cup of water, a shared quilt, and the quiet, stubborn decision to stay. If this story moved you, please let me know. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear that, and also like, comment, and subscribe.